Media's special report on facing grief during the holidays with author and longtime minister, Dr. Bob Terry. I'm your host, Jennifer Rash, and joining me from our TAB Media team is co-host Margaret Colson. Dr. Terry, thank you for taking some time to share with us today.
Oh, thank you for asking me. It's a privilege to be with you, and it's a privilege to talk about grief in the holidays because that's such an important topic.
Well, we are focusing specifically on grief related to the death of a spouse and how the holidays, especially the first holidays after the death, are typically difficult for the surviving spouse. Dr. Terry's grief journey began in 1998, a few years after he was named editor of the Alabama Baptist, a role he served until the end of 2018. It was during those years that I too learned a lot about the grief journey, merely by being part of the staff and part of Dr. Terry's life. It was out of that journey that Dr. Terry has released a new book, Struggling Toward Hope, Life After the Death of a Spouse, and it is now available. So Dr. Terry, we wanted to start there. Tell us a little bit about your story and how you use the book to detail your journey.
Oh, thank you. Eleanor and I were on a mission trip in South Africa. And on the way to the airport to come home, our car was T-boned by another vehicle. And as a result of that, Eleanor died from injuries suffered. She died on July 20th. And it just turned out that a month later was her birthday. Mm. And a month and 2 days later was our anniversary. So I was thrown into facing grief in special days immediately. And then, of course, came the Thanksgiving and came Christmas and all the drama that brings to people who are caught in grief.
Tell us a little bit about the writing of this book and how it happened to come out, be published now at this junction. It's been 23 years since you lost your beloved Eleanor.
Well, it has been a long time. And a lot of the book comes from that time frame. One of the things I was counseled to do was to try and keep a journal. Sometimes I did well, sometimes I didn't. But a lot of this book, in terms of the faith struggles that are reflected in it, come from questions I was dealing with on the journey. So a year after or 2 years after the death, I would spend time in the office reflecting on some of the faith questions, where I was, what the faith questions were, where I was at that time, where I had been, what my fears were, what my hopes were, and such. And in addition, I did a lot of work with grief. In grief groups, speaking about grief to different places. Near the end of my time at the Alabama Baptist, there was part of the journey I had kept to myself and not shared very widely. And I decided that because Alabama Baptist had cared for me so much in all of them, those years, that I owed it to them to share some of the more private things. So I did a series of 6 articles in the Alabama Baptist. That series was well received. And with the encouragement that came from those 6 articles, I was asked if I would put together a book. I'd been encouraged to write all that time, but I had declined to do that. So after the articles were published, and with the encouragement from people who read them, I set about trying to journal my story. But in addition to telling my story, I wanted the book to be helpful because as I did the readings that grieving people do, I didn't find a lot of help with how do you face the practical changes that come when you lose a spouse. And I thought, okay, I can come from my journeys, what I learned in grief group, what I've learned by working with others, and offer some practical suggestions. And there's very little about the faith questions that come in grief. For example, did God fail us? Or where was God when this happened? Those were issues I had to deal with. Now, I would not even pretend to say that I found the answers, but by dealing with them and sharing how I dealt with them, I hope readers will see that it's okay to open oneself to God. I mean, God knows our questions anyway. So when we acknowledge our questions, we're setting the table to have a conversation with God, to listen to God, to talk to God, to learn and grow in the experience. So I've shared my story. I've shared how you can face some of the practical changes. I've shared some of the faith questions I ask and how I tried to deal with them. And I've shared the end of the story because it has been more than 20 years since Eleanor died. I shared what's happened since then, hoping that people will find some practical suggestions, some encouragement, and perhaps encouragement to share their own questions and issues with God and not bottle them up inside.
Dr. Terry, one thing I remember hearing you say, and I was just looking to see, I think you wrote it on the back. I remember hearing you share and talk through how you had been a longtime minister, seminary trained, all the stuff.
Yeah.
You had walked through grief with family after family after family, and in your mind, you had this. I got it. I know what to do. And you write that how you learn on the back. You write how you learn the difference between studying grief academically and knowing grief personally. Is that some of what you are working through in this book too, and sharing with people, maybe from the ministry side, people who already think they have, they know what to do, they know how to handle this?
Uh, in the book, I share an episode that as Eleanor was approaching death, I kind of gave her permission. Obviously, she didn't need permission, but I said, I'll be okay. And that was one of the most insane things I had ever said, because that was said academically. It was said because I had studied grief. I had done special seminary study in grief. I had done pastoral education in grief. I had been pastor. I had preached on dying. I had all this theology that was there. But when it happened to me, I learned that there is a vast difference, as you said, between studying something academically and understanding something academically and the emotional and practical impact it has on me. So I was ushered into a new journey. And the book reflects that. A couple of pastors have written reviews that said that the book should be on every pastoral counselor's desk. And I appreciate that, because the book does try and bridge that gap between what we learn in seminary or what we learn from reading books and the emotional, mental, personal impact that grief makes on one when that individual walks the grief journey. Now, Margaret had a similar experience. She can speak to that as well.
Yes, I can. Let me ask you kind of a two-sided question from your perspective as a minister.
Yeah.
I'm not a minister, so from your perspective as a minister, did you somehow sense that you shouldn't be questioning God during this
Oh,
time of
yes.
grief?
Yeah. Oftentimes in the church, we celebrate the fact that this person is now with God.
Right.
It was not where Eleanor was that I grieved. It was where Eleanor wasn't. She wasn't with me. And sometimes the church doesn't understand that grief is very personal for all the things that it robs us of. Sometimes we're taught that if we question God, that we're sometimes sinning. And when the church gives that kind of message, the church is not being helpful to the grieving person. The church is saying you don't have enough faith. You're not obedient as you should be. You should just accept what happens and give thanks for it. I think the verse says that in all things we give thanks. We don't give thanks for all things that happen to us, but in the midst of all things we give thanks. That's God's will, that we always give thanks to him, no matter our condition. But the thanks is not always for that condition. So ministers especially have trouble understanding that in the midst of pain, it's okay to say, God, why? God, where were you? Now, I'm not sure we'll ever find a satisfactory answer, but in the conversation, I learned that God was there in the midst of it. God was there working in my life. God was there working in the situation, working in Eleanor's life, in the midst of all the pain and in the midst of everything that happened. God is faithful. He will not abandon us. And I can shout that forever and ever, but it is not wrong to say, God, I don't understand.
Right.
Help.
Let me ask a quick follow-up question, and I'll let Jennifer speak also. But as we are entering the Christmas season, when Emmanuel, God with us, Jesus came to earth as a baby, and we celebrate. How did you sense God was with you during the darkest days of your grief? And how can that give us hope now at Christmas for those who are grieving?
I'm not sure that a person who is caught in the midst of grief can sense God's presence. Now, I don't mean that to be as stark as it sounds, because God never abandons us. But grief makes us numb. Grief makes us numb emotionally, except to the loss that we have. Grief slows us down mentally. That's why it slows us down physically. That's why grieving people have a higher rate of accidents. That's why grieving people have a higher rate of suicides. That's why grieving people will sit in front of a computer for hours on end and not know what they've done. Why they read the same books, same pages over and over again and know nothing of what it says. Why grieving people think they're going crazy sometimes. Because we are emotionally and mentally and physically impacted by grief. And we need to recognize that. For me, it was what I had learned. I had learned when you cannot see God's hand, trust his heart. So it was the fact that in days past, God had proved himself faithful. It was the fact that I knew God would not desert me. I was his child through faith in Jesus Christ. I just held on to that truth until the numbness began to wear away and until I could begin to feel and to reason and to act again. And that took some time. It didn't happen the next week or the next month, to be honest. It took some time. That's part of the grief journey.
Right, it is.
Well, Dr. Sherry, you mentioned Margaret. She lost her husband, first husband, 17 years ago. You lost Eleanor 23 years ago. And, we were talking about how you were reading and looking for stuff originally. Part of why you've written the book is to add some extra pieces. When is it that you're able to actually comprehend grief books and resources and information? Because in hearing you both speak and share, the numbness is there. So, so as people are listening to this and thinking, "Oh, my mother or my father or my friend, this book would be a good resource," is there a sweet spot of the time when a grieving person can actually accept a book or a resource and be able to read it?
Well, Margaret can speak for herself. I'll tell you about me. Uh, I was blessed with friends who cared about me
Okay.
and who came to visit me and who brought me grief resources, who brought me books. And I read about 20 plus books during that first 6 weeks or so.
Mhm.
Um, really, I've come to the conclusion that in the first month, people are so busy with the practical things of grief. You have the funeral in the first week. You have immediate changes that you are forced into. There are legal issues you have to deal with.
Mhm.
You are surrounded by family and by church in that first month.
Right.
But after about 6 weeks, that begins to fade away. And you become more and more on your own. The church doesn't stop caring, but the immediacy of the caring has to go to others. The family doesn't stop caring, but their lives continue as well. And you gradually move to be on your own.
Mhm.
So I have suggested to people that a month to 6 weeks after the death of a person is a wonderful time to
Mhm.
take a resource and hand it to them and to say, here is a book. Here is the reason I'm giving it to you. I think you should look at it.
Okay.
And for me, that was helpful. And I've suggested that for others.
Mhm.
And
Now,
I do agree with that, Dr. Terry. And in my situation, I would like to ask you about this. I found that even though I'm a wordsmith, words are quite often inadequate to fill the void that you have in your life. However, the ministry of presence is so incredibly important. And even for me, I still had young children at home, and just having a neighbor or a friend say, "Why don't you go with me to that school banquet so you won't be going by yourself?"
yeah.
That's what meant the most. Can you speak to that?
Oh, certainly can. Uh, so frequently, people say, if you need me, if I can help you in any way, give me a call. What they fail to realize is that the grieving person can't make that call. The grieving person has already been abandoned by the individual who died. Now, I don't mean that as an indictment for the person who died, but the grieving person is left alone. There's a void that's there in their existence now. And they are not in the position to risk another rejection. Oh, I'm sorry, I've already got this, or I can't do that right now. Can we do it then? So, and they don't want to be a burden to anybody. I've got to be strong. I've got to make it on my own kind of thing. So the grieving person doesn't call. It really is a whole lot better for the friend to call and say, Margaret, we have this event at school. I'll pick you up at such and such a time and we'll go together. Or Bob, I'm going to come by and pick you up and we're going to go get a cup of coffee. I might resist, but a friend knows to push through that initial resistance. They know it's going to be good. They know that us who grieve need to talk. One of the things that a lot of people fail to realize is that people who have lost a loved one, especially a spouse, need to tell their story. They need to know that someone cares, that someone will listen, that someone is there. And our special friends who take the initiative and come alongside us and make us get out of the house, make us engage with people,
Mhm.
are doing a great ministry to us. And more people need to realize that.
And
That's
that,
my experience.
yeah, and that reminds me of the again, something you taught me was the fact of sharing memories that we have of the the spouse or the person that's died, no matter who it is, to be able to we remember or we share to say the person's name, things that a lot of people get uncomfortable about. A lot of times they want to act like don't say anything to act like it's not happened, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
That's
the
actually
grieving the
helpful.
lost person or the fact of death is the elephant in the room that no one wants to name. So we go to a Christmas family gathering
Mhm.
and nobody mentions that Eleanor's not here or so and so's not here. We're afraid that if we mention the name, that we're going to create a scene. We're going to cause somebody to cry. Well, it's okay to cry in the first place, but I'm not going to go there. Grieving people need to know that the one they loved mattered to individuals. They need to hear people call the name of their loved one. They need to hear people tell anecdotes of their relationships or interactions with the one who died. They need for the community around them, their family, their friends, their church, to give evidence that the person they love, the person that died, is important, was important, continues to be important. So
Mhm.
I would urge people,
Mhm.
when you are around someone who has lost a loved one, call their loved one by name, tell stories, do all these kind of things that are affirming to the loved one that the individual was important, continues to be important, is not forgotten or put into a box of memories somewhere,
Mhm.
but they continue to live in the hearts and minds of their friends and their neighbors and their family.
Mhm.
Let me expand on that just a little bit. And I know that you have remarried, and I have remarried after losing my husband. How do you see remarriage as a part of the grief journey? And in that remarriage, how can you continue to keep the memories of your loved one alive?
Well, first of all, I want to say uh, that remarriage can be difficult and can be problematic if the individual has not done the grief work necessary to work through the emotional and mental and relational issues created by death. Now, an example. Uh, Obviously, I've talked to more men about death than I have women, so I can't speak there. I'll just speak for men. Many of the men with whom I've worked through the years have been incredibly lonely after the death of a spouse. And I know that loneliness. I had it too. And the temptation is to believe that if I can just get married again, the loneliness will go away and everything's going to be okay. So I've had friends who got married 3 months after their spouse died. Whatever, I just use that as illustrative. And 2 or 3 years later, they're divorced again.
Mhm.
One of the things we need to realize is that you cannot work on two relationships at the same time. Those of us who've lost a spouse have to work on transforming the relationship we had with the one who died from a relationship of presence to a relationship of memory. And that's hard to do. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of time, and a lot of work. But until we've made that grief journey, where we are at the point that we can be positive and looking forward, and we're not working out of using someone to fill a gap in our lives, to help us where we're hurting. Because in the grief journey, you're going to hurt different places at different times along the road. And if you get into a relationship to fill this hurt, then when that hurt goes away and you're dealing with another hurt, that person can't do it for you. So I am very strongly committed to the fact that you have to work through the relationship you had with your spouse who died before you have anything positive to offer to a new relationship. Now, for me, it was 4 years. That's a long time. I wanted to get married again. Jennifer knows that, and my close friends know. I had a wonderful, happy marriage, and I wanted to be married again. And I pushed too hard, and I created problems and all of that. But 4 years later, I had worked through some issues. I had done the grief work personally, mentally, emotionally, academically. I had done the grief work. And God brought somebody into my life. And we got married a few months after we met. That's sometimes hard. Yeah, that's sometimes hard for family. And I think it's important to mention that too. I'm guilty of acting like a teenager when I was in my 50s.
You never.
Yeah. And that was not right. I didn't treat my family right. I should have been more considerate of them, because we have to remember they lost someone too.
Right.
They lost a mother. And so we need to be considerate of family as we form relationships. But it is incumbent on families not to live in the past, just like it's incumbent upon those of us who lose a spouse not to live in the past. The family has to do the work, like those of us who lost a spouse has to do the work, and we have to embrace the future that God provides for us. So this Thanksgiving, my son at the table acknowledged all the pain of the past, Eleanor's death, and how God had come and worked in the midst of all of the bad to bring about good. And was able, as he's done before, but again, to affirm the goodness that had come to our family, not only to me, but to our family, because of the relationship I have now with my wife, Pat. Because that was good for me, and it was good for all of us. So I affirm remarriage, but I urge with all seriousness, do the grief work first. It's okay to be lonely. It's okay to hurt. It's okay to cry. But it's like a storm. Put your face into the storm and walk through it. And don't huddle down behind a rock and get caught in neurotic grief. Because those who simply try and replace and go forward are forever trapped in neurotic grief and cannot heal and don't have anything positive to offer a new relationship. Now, I know that sounds emphatic. I probably should put some adjectives around it to make it a little less so. But that's where I've come out over the years.
And Dr. Terry shares all of this and more in his book, Struggling Toward Hope. We will have the information in the show notes, as well as contact information, because as you can tell, Dr. Terry is very experienced and would be glad to share with your groups as well. So Dr. Terry, thank you for joining us and sharing.
Thank you for the opportunity.